Okay, I think we will get started and people will trickle in as and if they do, but thank you so much everyone for being here. This is the first session of the conference, so thanks for choosing this one. It's going to be the best one, so you picked correctly. This session is Realizing the Right to Housing for Gender Diverse Peoples. I am super grateful to be moderating this session. My name is Chloe Halpenny. My pronouns are she, her, and very appreciative to be moderating as a member of the CAH board and a proud queer woman. This is, it's really nice when they set you up to moderate the session that you also wanted to go to the most, so just really worked out well for me. But this session and the conference, as we all know, is taking place in land colonially known as Halifax or Chibuktuk, which is on the traditional and ancestral territories of the Mi'kmaq people. And we are very, very grateful to be here and be welcomed so warmly this morning, if everyone had the chance to be in the main room this morning for a really beautiful ceremony. So thanks everyone for being here and really looking forward to a great session. The session will be focusing on the housing rights and needs of gender diverse people who are currently facing unique challenges and discrimination in the homelessness system. It's grounded in pan-Canadian research and a case study of Toronto's first adult 2S LGBTQIA+ shelter. Presenters will highlight the difficulties this underserved and overrepresented community faces, present possibilities for preventing and acting on rights violations for gender diverse peoples, and equip participants with the strategies and resources needed to create inclusive and welcoming spaces. So we've got 3 presentations. We'll do 20 minutes each and then hopefully have time for a question and answer period. And then everyone also obviously is encouraged to connect after the session as well, because often we never have enough time in sessions themselves. And everything will be available on the platform within a couple of hours, or I think at latest the day after the presentation. So you'll have a chance to rewatch and catch up after the fact as well. Am I missing anything else? We'll remind all of our presenters to speak into the microphone so our online friends can hear you. And I think that is it for now. So we've got 3 presentations. The first is Ensuring Housing Justice for Two-Spirit, Trans, and Non-Binary People in Canada, Recommendations for Homelessness Prevention and Community Action. That's Alex Nelson from the National Right to Housing Network and Jane Malenfant from McGill University. The second is 5 Arguments for Trans Inclusion in the Homelessness Sector by Cedar Michelle with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. And the last is Partnerships for Success, Organizing for 2S LGBTQIA+ Safety and Possibility. And that's with Andrew Wincher from the Homes First Society and Rebecca Houghton from the 519. So we will start by welcoming Alex and Jane. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, go for it. Thank you, Chloe. Hi, everyone. Good morning. How are folks doing? Did you get coffee? Some people are like, no. All right. Thank you so much, Chloe. I feel like we're going to talk about some findings from research that we've done, and the community action piece not as much, but we are jazzed to talk about that in the Q&A and anytime people want to. How does this work? I should know this one.
Things. Do you want to just like tell me when?
Oh, yeah. Uh-oh. Oh, no. I should know how to do this by now. My name's Jane Malenfant. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm based in Tiohtià:ke, where I work at McGill University.
Hello, everyone. Good to see some faces I recognize. Always happy to meet some new people. My name is Alex Nelson. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I am the Community Engagement and Research Specialist at the National Right to Housing Network. I also co-chair the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network, and as a person with lived experience, it really means a lot to me to be able to bring the full range of my lived experiences to this work and to this space, so thank you.
All right. Okay, so we're sharing work today that wasn't only done by us. Alex and I were part of a team that was working on this issue, including Caitlin Schwan and our colleague Mickey Watchhorn. And it was really important to us to do work with a team that was primarily made up of people who not only had lived experience of homelessness, but were gender diverse themselves. And so we really begin all of our work in our own lived experiences and our firsthand knowledge of what it means to navigate these systems and the barriers that can be there. But that lived experience is just a starting point, and it is a place for us to begin kind of our curiosity about what is happening for other people who might have different experiences than us, to be thinking of how we can be changing systems to support all gender diverse people. I don't know why I don't know how to use a PowerPoint all of a sudden. I'm like, how does this work?
Is it
Okay.
going?
I think it's going. Okay, yes. So this work also is ongoing. Alex and I are currently working with other folks who are people with lived experience, people working in the sector in different roles. But the things that we're going to be sharing today come from some reports that were commissioned by the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, particularly looking at the housing needs and experiences of Two-Spirit, trans, and non-binary folks in Canada. And so we'll be sharing some results from a pan-Canadian survey that the Women's Housing and Homelessness Network did that we were involved with. I was involved tangentially. And some work that we did talking with people as part of this project through interviews.
So in order to undertake this project, we used a couple different methods. The first was literature review and analysis with a lot of resources that were compiled over the years by members of the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate who have direct expertise in this area. So we were really thankful to be able to have access to this breadth of resources that have been created and collected by community members over the years. So I know there are a lot of folks in this room whose work we've probably read and cited as part of undertaking this work, and we really honor and recognize the long history of folks in our community doing this work and putting these thoughts together and sharing their voices and experiences. In addition to the scoping and literature review, we also had key discussions with gender diverse advocates across the country who are doing work in their communities to keep people housed, to keep people alive. And it was really important for us to have these conversations because the landscape is always changing, and it's really important that we're always connecting the work that we're doing back to people who are on the front lines and are deep in this work, supporting people that they care about. One of the things we heard through these conversations over and over was that people feel over-researched, especially Two-Spirit, gender diverse, transgender, and other gender diverse folks feel like we've had these conversations before. We've shared our knowledge. We've shared our stories. What's next? What's going to happen next with the things that we've been saying over and over and over for years? And so we really wanted to hold that understanding as central to the work that we are doing now and the work that we do moving forward, because it really is so important that, we're not just doing research for research's sake, but that we're making sure that we're building on the stories and voices that have already been shared loud and clear. We also engaged with data collected through a national quantitative survey from the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. That work was done with over 500 women, girls, and gender diverse people, and contained a lot of really important insights into experiences of homelessness and violations of the right to housing. And it was really helpful to see all of these pieces from the conversations we were having, from the literature review, and from this quantitative survey to start to put together a more kind of comprehensive picture for ourselves, including our own lived experiences of these issues. And so that's what we're going to be talking about more today.
A quick note on terminology, which is something we actually talked a lot about as a team made up of people who identified in different ways and sometimes ways that were shifting and being figured out while we were doing this project, including one of our team members who identifies as Two-Spirit. We recognize that we use the term kind of gender diverse as an umbrella, meaning to speak about a lot of different people who identify in different ways and express their gender in different ways. We also recognize that this isn't necessarily reflective of how everyone identified. We tried to make it inclusive, but we also recognize as we're doing this project, people's understandings of gender and how they talk about it are shifting. And so across kind of two-spirit, transgender, genderqueer, non-binary, or other gender diverse people, we just want to emphasize that a nuanced understanding of this is actually part of assuring housing rights and is part of the work to be thinking of housing rights for people in these communities, and isn't kind of incidental to how we talk about it, but is really integral to our work and the work of supporting folks.
So there were many, many themes that came out through this work, but 3 that we wanted to talk about today and that we thought were just really clear and integral throughout the conversations that we had were the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to security of tenure, meaning legal protection against forced eviction, harassment, and other threats, and right to affordability and habitability in housing. And there are so many things that make housing unsafe, unaffordable, uninhabitable for queer and gender diverse people. And so this really helps kind of bring all of those pieces into the forefront, into our understanding of how we can challenge those barriers and change the system that we currently operate within with its rigid gender binary. And we'll talk about a bit more about each of these pieces in the next sections of our presentation.
All right. So I mentioned to our co-presenters that I usually don't do a presentation with a bunch of statistics, but now I'm going to do just that. So sorry in advance, but we wanted to share some of the key things that came out of, first and foremost, the survey that we've discussed, because I think this is one of the first times that we were able to engage with a survey of this size that included folks who identified as gender diverse. And so we're going to share some key themes from that. So around poverty, violence, and trauma over the life course, this was something that came out. And so 84% of gender diverse participants identified as being a survivor of trauma and abuse. 21% of gender diverse participants identified as having experienced sex trafficking, and 84% of gender diverse participants didn't have full-time or part-time employment. And in order to make ends meet in their most recent housing situation, 41% of gender diverse people had cut back on necessities, and 39% had borrowed money or went into debt. And we're going to share statistics. I know sometimes this feels kind of violent to just be like, this is it. But I think that these statistics have shaped how we're doing this work. And so I'll share a few more, I think.
Yeah, and sorry to share more statistics. I also feel like, having the lived experience of some of these things, it sits really heavy in your heart to see the numbers on the screen. And so hopefully we can also have more of a conversation about, what these numbers actually mean for our communities and for each other. 44% of gender diverse participants reported having to move out of their housing due to problems with the condition of the housing. For example, having bed bugs, no heat, poorly maintained units, things that overall contribute to worse health outcomes for people. 69% of gender diverse people reported being unable to find or maintain housing due to affordability issues. This is a huge concern because it shows that the lack of affordable housing in our communities is leading people into homelessness and horrifying experiences. 41% of people reported feeling unsafe in their place or in their neighborhood. And the thing that we heard over and over, and the thing that was very clear throughout the survey, was that people just want a safe place to live. They want housing to be able to build their communities, to be able to build their families and their kin networks, and just have a place that they can call home. And so many people don't have access to that right now.
Yeah, I think similarly, we talked to so many people, and I mean, I've experienced this across different communities, that even before experiences of housing precarity, they were facing immense discrimination in multiple systems. And so those experiences of discrimination might come before experience of homelessness, but maybe not, maybe they're intertwined, but are really long-standing and key themes that came out of people's, what they were sharing with us. And so 26% of gender diverse people lost their housing due to discrimination and or harassment. And this looks like many things. It might be insidious, it might be overt, but people were saying they felt that discrimination as they were trying to secure housing. 43% reported experiencing discrimination from landlords and our property managers on the basis of their gender and their gender expression. And 41% reported having experiences of discrimination and or judgment from staff at homeless shelters and drop-ins. And so I think this is something we'll hear about more, but people were finding that even if there was some part of a service that was saying they were trans inclusive, they were often still facing discrimination from folks as they were trying to access services.
As you all know, housing isn't just the physical structure or habitation that people live in, and there's deep intersections with other public systems and the failures that are taking place across that system. So people spoke to a range of different intersecting experiences that compounded what they were feeling and experiencing in their housing. So 19% of gender diverse people were more likely to indicate the healthcare system contributed to their housing and homelessness. Almost a third of gender diverse people indicated the education system contributed to their housing instability and homelessness, 28%, and almost 3 times more than cisgender women who took part in the survey as well. A third of gender diverse people indicated the criminal justice system contributed to their housing instability and homelessness, which was almost double that of cisgender women. Gender diverse participants were significantly more likely to have had child welfare system involvement as a child, 43%, compared to cisgender women, and 56% of gender diverse participants reported encounters with the criminal justice system. This is really important because these experiences follow people throughout their lives, and it compounds over time, and these things are also contribute to worse health outcomes, worse housing outcomes. And the thing people were really good at naming the ways that systems impacted them. They were really good at naming, colonization, white supremacy, cis-hetero patriarchy as they operated in their lived experiences. People really are the experts at identifying these things, and so hold the answers to be able to change the system that they're currently living within and surviving.
Yeah, absolutely. More statistics. So security of tenure, also something that came up. 46% of gender diverse people lost their most recent housing due to a breakup, and so this is something we weren't necessarily anticipating would be such a significant factor. 43% of gender diverse people lost their most recent housing because they were told to leave by someone they live with. And so these kinds of interpersonal things often, I think, get lost, but are really important and significant in how people are losing their housing. And gender diverse people were twice as likely to report being unable to access legal support with regards to their housing situation, so over 50% compared to the cisgender women who responded to this particular survey. And so that's really significant in terms of thinking of stability and security of tenure.
It's also about changing the narrative about how we think about housing and homelessness. And I think the fact that Jane shared about people's experiences leading from a breakup, that's not part of our current conversation about homelessness in this country. And it really needs to be because it is such a significant factor for people's lives. So experiences of homelessness. 43% of gender diverse people experienced homelessness before the age of 16. Gender diverse people were significantly more likely to be unable to access a shelter bed when they needed one. Gender diverse participants were more likely to sleep in a public place, like a vehicle, transit station, abandoned building, or other spaces like these, than cisgender women experiencing homelessness. and almost a third reported residing in a tent encampment or self-built shelter in the last year. Many people cited safety concerns, that they felt more safe and had more agency over their space in these kinds of situations. They were making that choice within the range of limited options that many people face. Over half of gender diverse respondents had spent more than 6 months homeless in the last year.
And so for our team, I think, data is important and it gives us a picture of what's happening, but also these statistics were mobilized in conversations with people who were navigating this or supporting people firsthand. So whether they were staff or they were supporting their community or there were people navigating it firsthand, we were able to sit down and say, like, this is something we see happening. And we really also wanted to focus on the things that people were seeing in their experience, but also the things they were doing to keep each other alive in spite of systems not doing that or actively harming them. And so I wanted to share some things that came out of those conversations that we had. And so the first one says, there's a lot of invisible homelessness in Northern Ontario, but it feels like as long as it's kept hidden enough, it's assumed that there is no problem. And if you ask folks in my community where are the homeless people, they would say there probably isn't anyone. And so I wanted to highlight this in particular because I think often when we think of gender diverse people and services, we think of urban centers. And for myself, I'm from Northern Ontario, no one would stay there and access services. Also, queer and trans people don't stay there often, but hopefully that's changing and people can actually stay in their communities and get the services they need. But there's this lingering idea within particular communities that this isn't a need, and we know from this data and from other research that this is not true. One person we talked about really emphasized the need to be strategic about how you're presenting so that you can access services to keep you alive, and said, trans people walk a fine line between when it's worth asserting your identity and when you choose to keep your head down. It's constant trade-offs between your authenticity and your safety, a shitty reality we have to deal with. And so many people shared this, that if they entered a service, they would have to shift and strategize what they were able to do and how they were able to feel like themselves, and that this was a trade-off sometimes they refused to do, and they just wouldn't access services in those cases, and that's something we should not be allowing to happen. And another person spoke specifically about what this means for Two-Spirit people and connection with culture as something that they often also had to trade off, either accessing services for gender diverse folks or that were trans and queer inclusive, or accessing Indigenous services, and their work to try to marry those two and create spaces where people can come in authentically themselves. And they shared, I've seen nothing work universally with Indigenous people other than reconnecting with place. Not necessarily abandoning everything they know and growing out their hair tomorrow, but finding self-understanding through place. Coming home for me was not intentional, but it's been incredibly healing in so many different domains. And so they also, while we were speaking with them, emphasized the need to be thinking broadly about what supports for gender diverse people mean across different communities in Canada, and really intentionally asking people, what do you need to feel at home and feel like you have a sense of community, whatever that looks like.
And we also wanted to share just some thoughts about invisible labor and hidden homelessness, and the experiences of people who are marginalized along a number of different factors. So this quote says, "For me, the biggest issue for multiply marginalized persons like Indigenous sex workers, non-binary Indigenous children, it's those hidden ways in which obtaining housing, having housing, and these threats of eviction, of being bumped down the waiting list, being in social housing and having rent raises, those kinds of threats are unknown to my mother, who has lived in her home for 40 years after paying her mortgage." It's really important that we talk about the things that we have experienced and start to shed light on some of these hidden intersections. It's been really important for me as a person with lived experience, connecting with other people with lived experience to help kind of build a community so that we can do the really hard work of systemic change and transformative change. I think, one of the things that also came out in our conversations is a kind of hope, a possibility that things can change, even though things feel so heavy and so devastating in a lot of this work. People spoke to the need to just hold something in their hearts, to have something, a better future that we're working towards together. It's also really important that training is offered, support is offered, resources are offered to try and move this work forward as much as possible and in as many spaces as possible. And I think conversations like this one, where we can all come together and do some collective brainstorming, this is where the really important work in between the spaces of the system can actually take place and take root.
Thank you so much, everyone. If you want to check out more about what we're talking about today, you can take a peek at either of these or come talk to us at the conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex and Jane. The part that I forgot to mention was that I'd give you 5 and 2 minute warnings, but I didn't need to because you were super on time. So thank you for a great presentation and for making my job very, very easy. Next up, we have Cedar with 5 arguments for trans inclusion in the homelessness sector, and I will try to figure it. We'll switch your slides.
I don't need them. So nice to get to follow you folks. Like, I feel like I could spend this whole 20 minutes just reacting to those statistics, just trauma dump on you. Yeah, my name is Cedar Michel. I am the French content coordinator on the comms team at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and I really want to thank the COH for supporting me in doing presentations like this and being out here with you folks. If you don't know the COH, we've got a table down in that space there. Please drop by and learn about it. I live in Hamilton, Ontario, and I have lived experience of youth homelessness and incarceration, both of which advise the things I'm going to share with you today. And even though I'm on the comms team, you're going to see my PowerPoint is not beautiful. So it's not my job, usually. And I want to just start, before we jump into it, I want to start with a bit of a content warning. I want to talk about trans inclusion, but to do that, I'll also be talking about transphobia and how and why trans people are excluded. So take care of yourself. Feel free to leave. I won't take it personally. And I'm going to hang around outside at the end of the session if you need to debrief. Well, why argue for trans inclusion? Why should we even participate in a conversation in which people's basic rights are called into question? First, not everyone is required to do this. To expect every trans person to have to be prepared to debate their rights is transphobic, and even many allies don't feel they should have to, and this is perfectly understandable. That said, though, there are situations, notably at work, where you might want or have no choice but to argue in favor of trans inclusion. And when that happens, it makes sense to be ready for it. Secondly, we're in the middle of a massive backlash against trans rights. And this is mostly playing out around institutional spaces like schools, prisons, and shelters. So even if trans inclusion isn't controversial in your workplace right now, there's a good chance this backlash will reach you there at some point. And it's likely already impacting your trans clients and colleagues. It's likely that trans people will lose rights in the next few years if we don't do a good job of fighting back right now. All it will really take is some political party kind of opportunistically latching onto this movement. Finally, is a reason for why to argue about trans rights is that conversations allow people to change and grow. We're not required to help each other change and grow, but it does probably make the world a better place. And the public debate about trans inclusion was very short relative to a lot of gains in rights. Like if you compare it to the decades-long campaigns leading to women getting the right to vote, or the civil rights movement, or even marriage equality. More so than other liberation movements, trans inclusion in Canada happened from above rather than below. And this means that the general level of sympathy and understanding in the population at large is kind of low compared to that of other successful struggles. We're therefore in a position of having to defend a right rather than fight to obtain it. But the long, slow work of persuasion is the same. So I want to give you 5 arguments for trans inclusion. And this is definitely not everything there is to say about the subject. These may not even be the best or most convincing arguments. Please, if you want to, during the discussion, give me your better ones. They're just ones that I've personally had to make while accessing services. So here they are. Trans people have the right to be included. Access without safety is no access at all. Inclusion defeats fear and base expectations on behavior, not identity, and disproportionate need and disproportionate harm. Let's jump right in. Yeah, it's a beautiful slide. In 2017, the Canadian Human Rights Act was amended by Bill C-16 to add gender identity and expression as a prohibited grounds of discrimination under Section 3.1. This makes it illegal to discriminate against trans people in the same way that it's illegal to discriminate against women or people of color. And provincial human rights tribunals have gone into more detail about what constitutes discrimination. So I'm from Ontario, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission is clear that designing services in such a way that trans people cannot access them is discrimination. It says there's a positive duty to accommodate trans people to promote their integration and full participation. This protection is far from perfect and doesn't guarantee a barrier-free experience. So for instance, services can still require ID, which forces many trans people to out themselves. And prisons and shelters may not allow trans people to share a room or certain other kinds of spaces. But it is something that has led to real change. So this might all sound very clear-cut, like we could just end the presentation right here, like bing, bang, boom, rights. But I don't know if you found this in your work, but the rights discourse is often unconvincing. It doesn't address why people are opposed to trans inclusion. And it's basically just an appeal to authority. It doesn't get at the underlying prejudice. So I do think we have to go a little bit further than just asserting a right. A lot of people who are opposed to trans inclusion in the homelessness sector aren't actually proposing not providing services to trans people at all. Rather, they argue that services should accommodate people based on sex at birth rather than gender identity. So in this logic, trans people would be included in trans women would be included in men's shelters and trans men in women's shelters. And this is mostly how things have worked historically, and the result has been that trans people are less likely to access services, leading to worse outcomes. And the reason for this is that sex at birth ignores safety as a basis for inclusion. It results in trans people being outed and placed in situations where they'll be exposed to harassment or violence. Further, the simple fact of treating a trans woman as a man, for instance, is itself a form of harassment, and this is confirmed by most provincial human rights tribunals. It's insulting and hurtful and is enough to make a service unsafe. So real inclusion only happens with safety, and safety comes with choice. Trans people should be given the choice of which gendered services they feel most comfortable accessing. And those who feel there can be inclusion without safety aren't advocating for inclusion at all. And most people who advocate for this kind of false inclusion are doing so out of prejudice. Some prejudices about trans people that you might have heard are that they're predatory, deceitful, mentally unstable, violent, or fake. But prejudice is based on fear. Advocates for false inclusion aren't acting from a desire to have good outcomes for trans people, but rather from the fear that the presence of trans people will in some way harm others. And this is why rights-based arguments are so unconvincing. That trans rights are seen as trumping other people's rights to safety, but this is only because trans people are seen as threats. It might seem paradoxical then, but the best way to combat fear is through inclusion. By allowing trans people to access gendered spaces based on choice, we begin to break down fear and prejudice because we create positive examples of inclusion in practice and give different people the chance to get to know each other. I've seen this work in the context of prison, where threats to safety are very real and constant. You've got to actually take safety seriously. The presence of trans people there has gradually led to understanding, reducing fear, and making the process of inclusion less difficult. Maybe surprisingly, the average range in the provincial prison system is often more trans-inclusive than a lot of services on road. So with the exception of hardened transphobes, people are more likely to change their views because of experiences rather than from arguments. If there are individuals in your workplace who are opposed to trans inclusion, this can actually be a reason to move ahead with it, since it's the surest way to change minds. I don't want to brush away concerns about safety. They're super real. I've seen trans women behave badly in women-only spaces, including situations of intimidation, violence, and harassment. But that said, I've seen cis women do exactly the same things, and these issues are not being brought into the homeless sector by trans people. There will always be people who engage in predatory behavior, and some of those people will be trans. And sometimes we fight so hard against the prejudice that we only see trans and other marginalized peoples as victims, not as people who are also capable of reproducing harm themselves. However, when trans people cause harm or are accused of causing harm, this is often done in a way that calls into question their ability to access services based on choice. Prejudice can also lead to heightened scrutiny, meaning trans people's behavior is more likely to be perceived as a problem. So one response to all this, and I'm sure for any service providers here you're already doing this, is that having very clear norms for behavior with explicit consequences that are the same for everyone. Focusing on behavior rather than identity allows for a conversation about safety without calling into question trans people's rights. So it involves this process of reframing. Someone might come to you with a concern about the identity of someone accessing a service with them, and you can reframe that as a conversation about behavior. And that gives you the space to have the conversation about safety as many times as is necessary. If people are feeling afraid, their feelings are valid, they deserve some space, they deserve to have an actual conversation. But let's always reframe it to take away concerns based in transphobia and turn them into ones about behavior that apply to everyone. The goal here is, as always, to allow the fact of inclusion to reduce fear, which in turn breaks down prejudice. So finally, there is a strong ethical argument in favor of trans inclusion. Trans people are more likely to need homelessness services. According to the CMHC, trans people are twice as likely as the general population to experience severe poverty and homelessness. About a third of homeless youth identify as queer, genderqueer, and those youths are twice as likely to be homeless due to violence and abuse. Trans youths need to be able to access services safely. As well, when experiencing homelessness, trans people have distinct needs, which if they're not met can lead to this disproportionate harm. One example is around ID. Trans people might find themselves unable to use their ID because they don't use their legal name or their appearance may have changed, or like a lot of folks experiencing homelessness, they just lose their ID. In particular, access to a health card can be important since a lot of trans folks need access to gender-affirming care in addition to other necessary health care. So access to stable housing and support can allow trans people to go through the process of getting their ID changed, removing one barrier to their participation in society. Another example is around the need for privacy, since doing things like showering, changing, or using the toilet can lead to unconsensual outing. And yet another example is around need to know information, where it's very easy to cause harm. Generally, as few people as possible should need to know that someone is trans, and in particular, keeping trans people's dead names quiet is very important. I've seen people quit jobs or leave services over having their dead name revealed, often through bureaucratic process, like the name that appears on a form. This is not an issue for cis people. So taken together, trans people have a disproportionate need to be included by services and also experience disproportionate harm when those services fail to include them. Trans inclusion is an ethical imperative, since otherwise services are shutting the door on some of the people who need them most. So these arguments have a few things in common, and there's a reason why I've chosen to make these ones rather than different ones. One is that they try to avoid defining what a man or a woman is. Sure, yeah, trans women are women, trans men are men, but that really just leads to someone saying, no, they're not, or what's a woman then, which leads to really uninteresting conversations. I prefer to take the existence of trans people as a fact and their inclusion as a necessity, rather than arguing over whether or not a trans woman gets to be one of the girls. My arguments also don't depend on the characteristics of individual trans people. Yes, it's much easier to make a case that a very feminine-presenting trans woman who passes well belongs in women's services, and that physically large trans men should be fine accessing men's services. But this leaves a lot of people out, and probably those trans people were able to access services that correspond to their gender identity long before Bill C-16. So this kind of arbitrary person-by-person inclusion is common in the prison system, for instance, but the homelessness sector can and should do better. As well, these arguments try to stay focused on the goal of inclusion and not kind of get caught up in transgender metaphysics. Sure, it would be better if people understood gender identity and thought about sex and gender as being distinct, but ultimately the necessity is inclusion, not full agreement or understanding. Some people are fully capable of treating a trans person with dignity and seeing them as deserving of access to services without having a nuanced understanding of how gender or identity work. People who are hesitant about trans inclusion will become more open to thinking about these things as trans inclusion becomes a fact. As well, trans people don't all agree about how the metaphysics of trans identity work. Is this trans man a man who used to be a woman? Was he a man trapped in a woman's body? Or is gender fake and it's only perceptions that changed as his gender expression changed? Only he will be able to tell you what's true for him. So it's better not to get into it with people who are hesitant about trans inclusion. Do I have time still? Yeah. Great. So there's a few whatabouts kind of that are common in response to these arguments. And one of those is just what about hardened transphobes? What about the people who are kind of ideologically opposed to this? So among the people who are not comfortable with trans inclusion, there is a tiny minority who are actively hostile towards trans people and are often ideologically motivated. So I want to emphasize that it's a tiny minority, and most people who have these hesitations are not transphobic. They're just people who don't understand or who are experiencing fear, which again I think is understandable because safety concerns are real and valid. These kind of hardened transphobes might try to undermine inclusion efforts or may target trans people for harassment or may start like whisper campaigns within spaces. And this is where having clear norms about acceptable behavior that apply to everyone, like we discussed earlier, can come into play. Identifying these hardened transphobes and presenting them with the choice to either stop their behavior or leave is an important part of trans inclusion as well. Personally, I don't think that spending our time and energy convincing the most hardened opponents of trans inclusion is a good use of time. A better goal is simply preventing them from standing in the way of inclusion, creating the fact of inclusion. And then what about trans-specific services? Are these an alternative to inclusion in mainstream services? It's complicated, but the short answer is no. The longer answer is that I'm kind of agnostic about the value of trans-specific services. In the present, there are not nearly enough of these services to meet the needs of trans people, so inclusion remains a necessity. But even if there were, I'm not entirely sure this would be a good thing. Some trans people really value them, though, and some need them, so I hesitate to tell those folks they're wrong. But personally, my needs in accessing a service are so similar to those of other women that you'd have a hard time convincing me that sending me somewhere else is for my own good. If trans people need to be in a separate space from everyone else to get their needs met, this probably just speaks to a high level of transphobia in the sector as a whole. And anyways, trans is too broad of a category to talk about the needs of the whole group. For instance, many non-binary people will, for instance, never feel comfortable accessing a gendered space. I don't want to speak too much to the experience of non-binary people just as a binary trans person, but maybe we can get into that more in the discussion. Choice remains the key. Even if there were enough spaces in trans-specific services, trans people should still be allowed to choose which services to access. And that's all I've got for you today. Trans inclusion in the homelessness sector is indeed under attack, but it will remain a reality as long as service providers are committed to it. It will stay a reality through the patient work of having conversations and allowing people to experience inclusive spaces. Right now, the legislative attacks are mostly aimed at trans youth in schools, but there's no reason to expect it will stop there. And it's not that I don't think the legislative side is important, but I do believe that the real power is in the grassroots, in the decisions of everyday people and communities. Trans inclusion was, after all, a reality in many services long before they were required to do it by law. Maybe there's folks in this room who've been kind of leading the charge on this, and the legislation is just catching up with their efforts. So again, thank you for listening. My name's Cedar Michelle. I work at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. My email address is up there. Feel free to get in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cedar. And I think you're too hard on yourself about your slides. They were great. Okay, and last up, we have Partnerships for Success, organizing for 2S LGBTQIA+ safety and possibility. That's Andrew and Rebecca. I will change your slides.
Hello. Welcome to this part of the session. My name is Rebecca Hooten. I use she, her pronouns, and I am joining you from the 519 Community Center, which is a community center that specifically serves 2S LGBTQIA folks. I won't give you my full bio, but this is Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew. I work with Homes for Society, also in Toronto. We're a housing and shelter provider. I just heard this crazy stat that we actually run something like 20% of all shelter spots. So yeah, more, right? Yeah, so that's big.
This is what we'll talk to you about today, and we're just going to jump right in because we're going to talk to you about it. I'm doing context or doing context?
Yeah, I'll do context. Okay. So first, apologies. There was an issue with the slide. So what's missing is I just wanted to talk about some of the context in Toronto. And really, I just want to emphasize actually that these stats are totally out of date. This is from 2021. So the numbers are going to be worse when they come out. And what's missing is that even if we're using 2021 numbers, 12% of homeless folks identify as 2S LGBTQIA. And that's about already 875 people, right? So just, we want to be mindful of just the huge numbers that we're talking about in terms of this context when talking about 2S LGBTQIA homeless communities. It's big. Next slide. And I don't really want to belabor this because I think Cedar just spoke really so passionately about it. Maybe just to emphasize why we're talking about this and why this matters. The basic structural issues is important to underline before somebody who is trans or gender diverse or queer accesses a space. The way that shelters are gendered really matters, and it can lead to a devil's bargain where somebody can choose between accessing shelter and having to choose a gender presentation that doesn't work that isn't in line with their identity, or not take the service, right? And of course, that's something that we should all be trying to combat.
So a bit of historical context in regards to the project that brought us together and housing advocacy in Toronto. There have been, of course, many advocates doing this work for decades. There was a huge study in late 1990s looking at trans women's inclusion in shelters. And of course, we heard in that study a lot of devastating and awful things that unfortunately have been repeated over the course of numerous other studies, even numbers we've heard here today. So a little bit specific context, in 2002, there was a consultation done in partnership with the City of Toronto. 519 was a big part of that conversation. We didn't lead that one, but we were a part of it, where a number of service users, people who are residents in the shelter system or not, as the case may be, because they didn't feel that they could access those spaces, were in focus groups, as well as service providers and people sort of creating policy, talking about the barriers to access for trans folks. And so that happened in 2002. And then in 2022, another consultation was done. This time we were commissioned by the city to engage in another conversation with 2S LGBTQ folks, but specifically with trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks about their barriers to access within shelter systems. And unfortunately, we saw the same issues in both of these studies. So the recommendations that came out of the 2002 study were echoed in the 2022 study, which, for people in this room is probably not a surprise, despite how devastating and unfortunate that is. The takeaways from these recommendations were around, here, let me get this, queer strength, so the importance of acknowledging the people accessing these spaces and the importance of building home. I mean, a lot of what you've heard today is what we heard in these studies, because as was mentioned in our first presentation of the day, people are tired of being asked what the issues are, of being researched. Tell us what the problems are. We know what the problems are. It is what comes next. And so what these recommendations have shown us is that we need to act on the people who were already feeling over-researched in 2002 and act on those recommendations. So actually, the project that we, the 519 and Homes First, have brought together now was actually a recommendation out of the 2002 report that we finally were able to act on in 2022. And Andrew will give you a bit of context of sort of how that came about. But one of the major pieces that we've put a lot of importance on is looking at inclusive programming, inclusive staffing, the design around privacy and access, and having thoughtful protocols so people aren't having to retell their story of trauma time and time again. So, how do we create space that builds on what we know as queer and trans and led organization and integrate it into the housing sector? So that's a lot of what this conversation today is to share about.
And yeah, just picking up on that, the reason we're here is to talk about Pacewood, which is a small shelter in the downtown west core of Toronto. It's owned and operated by Homes for Society. It is a 2-floor open dorm style setting with some community space in the basement. There's a kitchen, there's laundry on site, different services. I can get into later if people are interested, the case management services that are involved. But an important piece of the partnership that I just want to underscore here is that there's a very unique referral system to the program, which is actually run by the 519. So the 519 is actually running referrals, bringing people to site and completing the referral process there to kind of minimize a lot of the standard oppressions around documentation that come up with supporting 2S LGBTQ folks coming into a shelter. So this is just a bit of a timeline. I'm not going to go over everything. I just want to emphasize maybe first just a bit of the prehistory. So the site was formerly a women identifying shelter called Savard's for a very long time. In 2020, I believe, because of COVID social distancing restrictions, the folks there were transferred to one of the hotel shelters that was set up. Savard's was closed. Starting in 2021, of course, we all know how bad the homeless issues are, so there was pressure by the city to come up with a new program, use any types of spaces available for new shelters. So a application was made, or kind of a pitch, to make what was then Savard's into a program for 2S LGBTQ adults. And through that process, it was accepted by the city. They were willing to fund it. They also were willing to bring on the 519 as our partner to actually do an initial report, which Rebecca was just talking about. And moving into November 2022, the site was able to open. Right, yeah. Anything else? No, it's good.
One of the things I don't think we've mentioned so far is that this is a program specifically for newcomers and refugees, so adults who are new to Canada. So that's something that's just to give the scope. But some of the strengths of this program you'll see we've written here, but really want to take sort of the space that we have created to a level that really is meeting the needs of this unique population. So having tailored supports, listening to what we know of our communities. We have a huge newcomer program at the 519, and we're supporting, obviously, Two-Spirit, queer and trans people all the time. That's the whole point of what we do. So bringing that knowledge into the space, and also listening to residents as they were sort of walking through and ensuring that the space felt possible for them. So the second floor of the shelter is specifically for gender diverse folks. That was something that was recommended in the report, that there be spaces specifically for trans, non-binary, and Two-Spirit folks, for gender diverse folks. So we have with the city that agreement that there will always be 50% of the beds that are saved for gender diverse folks. So even if there's an empty bed, which is quite rare, obviously, as folks may know who work in shelter systems, to be able to save a bed, have an empty bed, that was a kind of a bit of a pushback. But we said, if we start filling this with cis people, there's always going to be a need. Everybody knows here there's always going to be a need for shelter beds. And if we start filling those spaces, where do you draw the line? And all of a sudden, the entire space is filled with cis folks, and trans folks have nowhere to go. So we've managed to keep those sort of specific needs in mind. The idea of warm transfers, so we do a lot of the intake process at the 519 and sort of create that space for vulnerability. So if people are sharing, about anything about their history, we keep that in the intake form, and it kind of becomes a need-to-know basis. If there are, if people have their legal names on there, we're only sharing with the shelter intake folks the names that these folks are actually using, and their pronouns, and the information that the frontline staff actually need to know, not what is in those extensive forms. A lot of times that information doesn't need to be passed around, or not even a lot of times, it doesn't need to be passed around beyond an initial intake. So we try to keep that as minimal as possible. And then we also have the reality that our workers are continuing to engage with these individuals after they're in the shelter spaces. So there's a relationship to community that continues once they're living at Pacewood. Yes, all of these pieces. So making sure that we're keeping in mind the specifics of queer vulnerability and of trans people's needs in these spaces, and always having an ongoing conversation with Homes First and with the frontline staff doing training, and making sure that this is not a one-stop shop. We say, you're inclusive now, check mark, goodbye, that we're having this ongoing chat. Am I doing this? Yeah. So these stats, as Andrew was saying, these are always growing. We actually have had 4 people move out in the past week to spaces that are where they want to be. So that's a really exciting shift. When we first started, it was a much slower process. People were moving out at a much slower rate. We don't have any sort of timeline that people have to move out within, which is another thing that we really push for. We said, you can't just say in a space like in a city like Toronto, well, within 3 months of arriving in the city, you have to have access to a stable home. Of course not. That's not going to happen, right? I mean, hopefully it does, but the reality is that it probably won't. And so if we were to give timelines, then we're just pushing people to feel more stressed, and then probably have to move to another shelter, where what we are trying to do is create that sense of possibility for folks arriving in Toronto, whether they are just arrived within the past few weeks or have been here for a longer period of time, trying to make sure that they're not jumping around to other shelters, and that they are getting this continuous feeling of belonging in a community space. And then when they do move out, it is with intention, and because it's the right space, not just whatever comes up. So we've got, people who have moved on to permanent housing in a more sustainable way. We also have follow-up supports through our programs with the same workers who did the intakes. So people can be supported for up to a year after they've moved into their next home. We have over 30 countries represented, if not more than 30, above 30. And so you can see the queer and trans people are coming to Toronto, and I'm sure to all of your cities as well, from all over the world. So it's been a really interesting dynamic also to see how people engage with each other, coming from countries where it's perhaps illegal to be gay, to be trans, to be who they are openly. Not even just openly, but just to be who they are.
We can both do this one. So we didn't want to leave you thinking okay, this, yes, of course, we want a partner, that's great. Of course, there are always points of stress between different kinds of organizations, so we didn't want to sugarcoat that. Of course, we as a housing and shelter provider, we're beholden to shelter standards, which sometimes constricts what we can do in a certain situation, whereas 519 is coming from a social center and advocacy position. And it's 2 different places, 2 different forms of knowledge that have to learn to communicate with each other. It can be challenging where, doing referrals, the 519 gets to know clients beforehand, they develop relationships, then of course our staff are also developing relationships. It can be hard to figure out how that gets communicated sometimes. So there are issues that come up, but really where we wanted to wrap up and conclude with was, yes, there are going to be challenges when 2 different organizations come together, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. We need more safe to LGBTQIA shelters now. As Rebecca was saying, these reports are going back to 2002, right? And I'm sure even probably before that. I'm sure there's a prehistory. And what I wanted to leave you with, just from a conversation before the panel started, was a bit of an anecdote aimed at people who work for housing and shelter providers that maybe aren't queer focused, that maybe don't have a history of strong engagement. When I was in the very pre-stages of even thinking about a pitch, talking to my director, talking to different people, I happened to be in BC, and I was able to do a really amazing tour at Ross House, which is a trans and two-spirit housing site, really innovative. And I was kind of talking to one of the people there, explaining like, oh, okay, well, there's this potential site, but I don't really present as queer. I didn't have strong connections to the queer community, lots of privilege. What knowledge did I know? How, what our agency is not queer-led. Maybe this is a bad idea. Kind of talking myself out of it as I was talking to him. And the answer I got was like, you need to get on that plane and get back there and do this because it's an emergency. And what do you do in an emergency? You try to solve the problem. And of course, what I'm not saying is that that gives us a blank check to then not have the knowledge to avoid further oppressions with a very vulnerable group. It was super important that we brought on a community partner that actually had that knowledge. Like, that's why the partnerships are important. But I guess I'm trying to speak to maybe a fear sometimes that, if you don't have all the knowledge, maybe this isn't for our agency. And in emergency, it's more important to move forward, find the partnerships that are in your own communities, and do the work of making sure that your staff are knowledgeable, making sure that your agency continues to grow and have the knowledge and support that they need to do a program correctly, but to try for it. That's really important.
The work that I do is around inclusion training, specifically for shelter workers and the housing sector in general. Of course, that's expansive, as all of you know. But I do think it's a really important point that these partnerships are what can make this possible. I was at a conference in September with the Enchanté Network, which is a network across Canada of 2S LGBTQ-focused organizations. There are organizations doing this work in your cities or very close, even if you don't know that they exist. I didn't know a lot of those exist, and it was amazing to see and hear about the work that folks were doing in all sorts of rural communities across the country. And this, of course, applies in many EDI-focused endeavors. Partnering with organizations that have that knowledge means that you can lean on them as opposed to trying to do all the work that you folks are already doing, which is expansive and amazing and so much. I'm sure everyone in this room can sort of understand the idea of being overwhelmed, overtired, overworked, underpaid, all of these things, and it can feel a little overwhelming to also think about making your space the pinnacle of inclusion alongside that if you don't actually have the resources or the people within the organization willing to do that work. We should be, as an individual imperative, looking to be inclusive, and as organizations looking to do that work. But while all of that is happening, let's not wait till the end point of we are inclusive to be doing this kind of really important work. I think look to other organizations and say, hey, you have knowledge. How can we lean on each other? The 519 we had one housing worker who was only focused on youth housing folks that we had, for a number of years. And of course, one housing worker for youth, when you see the statistics that we've talked about today, is of course nowhere near enough. And this is just our first endeavor into housing. But I think it's really possible because we are looking at partnerships. We're not looking to create shelters ourselves. We're saying, you already do this work. Let's do it together. And so I really encourage you to seek out those partnerships and seek out those relationships and figure out how that can work for you and your organizations. We're all going to do this better together. So thank you so much for your time, and talk to you soon.
Great.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca and Andrew, as well as Alex, Cedar, and Jane, for those really thoughtful presentations and for so generously sharing your knowledge and experiences with us. A lot of food for thought there, and we have 25 minutes for questions and discussion. So I do not think that we have a traveling microphone, so it's going to be a little awkward, but we're going to make it work. If you have questions, I'll invite folks to raise their hands and ask them. I will try to do my best to summarize them back through the microphone so that everyone in the room can hear and folks online can hear, and then we'll invite presenters to come up and also share back through the microphone. I know it's a little clunky, but it makes sure everyone can hear. So with that, anyone want to start off with questions, comments? Yeah.
This question is more for 519 comes first. It's around, as the program is still fairly new, I'm just curious to know what was like the involvement of clients in terms of program implementation and like ongoing, like do you guys have like an advisory group that kind of continues to guide the process?
Okay, awesome. So question around new program and client involvement in program implementation and operation.
Thank you so much for that question. I think that people who know queer and trans people in this room will probably understand that we like to talk all the time about everything, feelings, involvement, and it's been really powerful in this space. So the workers who are doing the intakes are very much continuing that relationship with, so there's 3 housing coordinators on our end who sort of split up the 20 people throughout the 3 of them, and have that ongoing conversation about what are you experiencing in this space? You know, how are you engaging with Homes First? How are you engaging with each other? What kind of programs do you want to see? A lot of the work that we are technically mandated to do is really just around programming. It's not around that sort of wraparound care, but it's hard to not continue doing that because we want to make sure that people are having the best experience in the space. And so it's a lot of conversation about, you know, do we want to have arts-based programming or food-based programming? Do you want to come to 519? Do you want to be here? And then, you know, we hear from them, XYZ issue is happening in the space. Sometimes they've talked to Homes First. Sometimes they haven't talked to Homes First. And so then we get to have conversations with Homes First staff of, hey, so we're hearing some of this happening. What's your take on it? How is this, you know, showing up with your staff? Have they talked to you? You know, what's going on? To ensure that there's really that sort of feedback. I think it'll sort of solidify in a way as we build the program. Right now, it's still very much figuring it out as we go. But that's really powerful too, because it means that it is very much engaged with the people who are living there now and not just theoretically people living in the space. Which also can raise some contentious points where we're like, hey, you didn't tell us this. And Homes First, well, you didn't tell us this. And then we, you know, have to go back to the residents and say, hey, you know, it's your responsibility also as residents, if you're having an issue with a certain staff person, to talk to them. So sometimes we try to remove our own involvement because we want to also encourage people to have, you know, proper relationships with each other and feel empowered if there's something wrong to talk about it, or if there's something really right to talk about it. I don't know, your perspective.
Maybe what I'll add is just at the very beginning, there were concerted efforts through the consultation process to gain input into some of the structure. It can be challenging in terms of, I mean, I was in some of the focus groups, at least a couple. I was invited and honored to be there. And it's a really diverse set of needs and wants. And there were decisions that did have to be made in terms of this is something maybe that, you know, the shelter standards won't allow us to do, kind of thing. And that can be challenging to communicate. There had to be decisions made about which subsection of a very vulnerable community, many of whom are not newcomers, right, who do need still that support. We had to make that decision as well. So I just want to emphasize that, yes, consultations happen and that there are obviously some challenges, limitations in terms of setting up a shelter that come up.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think you, yeah, next.
My question's also for you.
Just stay standing.
I can project, I think you can hear me. But, okay, so when you're talking about the folks that you've transitioned to permanent housing, what does that look like? Like, is it like a scattered site program that you're putting them with another group, or is it literally just like their own place?
Details, transition to permanent housing.
And how are you, if it's their own place, how are you helping them navigate, like, signing a lease?
Yeah, it's sort of different. We don't have a next step spot. I mean, I think that would be an amazing next program, but we don't have that yet. So it is sort of the caseworkers who are Homes First staff helping people to find apartments and or to, you know, feel safe transitioning to living with a friend or a room, like things like that. So the caseworkers, the Homes First caseworkers are doing a lot of that work to engage with landlords and make sure that they are the right people and all of that. And then our coordinators are technically follow-up housing workers. That's sort of what the city has named them as their job. And so they can offer and do offer 3 months of intensive support after somebody has moved into a space, as well as up to a year of ongoing support. And so that's landlord relationships, that's helping to find furniture, connecting with other community services. And that's actually not just our shelter residents that we offer that support to. They can get referred to the 519 from any organization in the city who are working with a queer and trans person who says specifically, I'd like a worker who understands that part of my life.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you all for your great presentations. My question is also for you kind of just answered part of it, but so you had mentioned that you continue to support folks like for up to a year after they move out. So I guess I'm just wondering, like, how do you engage people once they've moved out, and what type of like specific programs or services, in addition to like a housing worker, would you provide to people once they moved out?
How you support people after they move out.
So I should be clear that that's not, I kind of went around what we're actually talking about, which is that that's not actually part of our Homes First partnership. That is, the City of Toronto has funded this support. So yeah, that's why I'm speaking to it and taking over the mic, sorry. So it can be a lot of different pieces. I know some folks have made sure that there is ongoing mental health care and checking in, especially in those first 3 months, because obviously moving to your own place, whether it's like we have someone, for example, who's living in a supported housing facility, that supported housing facility is not very supportive. And so making sure that they still have, you know, weekly connection, checking in, are you okay, what do you need? We also, you know, connection to our program. So we've got a newcomer and refugee program specifically at the 519 to help people navigate that process. So making sure they have a worker who's within our staff, that they're coming to our like weekly newcomer dinner activity and meeting other people, potentially, you know, creating that kind of, yeah, ongoing community. So it can be a lot of different things. Yeah.
I can talk a bit about the intensive case management program of Homes First, but really I just wanted to affirm again the importance and the value of partnerships in this case, rather than us as a housing and shelter provider having to create a whole bunch of new programs that can support folks. We have the 519 already so well placed to offer supports that we're not experts in, right? So just to reaffirm that idea of, you know, how much can be gained by working together with groups that already have so much knowledge, so many amazing programs all the time, that we can just always at the site be putting up posters for, promoting what's already there rather than having to build it new.
All right, Blue Blazer, you got to jump on the questions there.
Again, my question, I'll have two quick questions. One, for the folks at 519. You talked a lot about partnerships. In Ottawa, I volunteer with a group called Rainbow Haven that welcomes refugees. I know there's a lot of them just in Ottawa. There's probably like 13.
partnerships working with queer and trans refugees in Toronto?
I mean, I think the newcomer team definitely does have those. I know we've got a lot of people who work at 519 who have worked with Rainbow Railroad before, which obviously is a huge one. But I definitely think we are always looking for connections because, yay, connections. Sorry, I'm trying to give space to other folks. Thank you for your question. Let's talk.
Any questions? Maybe especially if you've got questions for other presenters, perhaps. Yeah. Everyone.
Sorry, and I really appreciate, Cedar, your comments around what to do around identifying identifying and confronting people who are transphobic, but not necessarily intending to convince them. Our biggest challenge, we run both shelter and support housing. I would definitely like to talk to Rainbow Haven in Ottawa. Our biggest challenge, and it's humbling to ask, like, what do you suggest? Because we've been doing it for a while. We just keep needing to do better, and partnerships, of course, is part. My question is this: how do we create community between the trans, non-binary, LGBT folks and the rest of the community? So in our shelter and in our supportive housing, where we actually have a very high ratio of gender diverse folks, we are constantly butted up against what they experience from other residents and creating communities. So there's not, well, there's us over here and there's them over there. And every time we think we have traction, there's a backside. Like any strategies, how do you how do you create that community between all of those folks? Any ideas?
All right. So strategies to create community between queer and trans and cishet service users. Small question.
I mean, it sounds like you're doing it, right? And it's just a long road. And I think that's, again, like the slow, patient work of persuasion and of like allowing the fact of inclusion to do its work. That like there's going to be problems, and I think sometimes those problems take up disproportionate space in our energy. Like when I've accessed services before, like I'll have 90% of people who I'm good with, and then they'll just be like the one person who's like, I had a bad experience with a trans woman one time, so fuck you. But honestly, like that person, like it's just a question of creating space from them, because I don't need to necessarily like be that person's friend. Like I don't need to necessarily like do programs with them. What I need is to be able to continue accessing the services that I'm there for and to have some level of community, right? The reality is just that like we're going to experience like refusal and exclusion and things like that, and we experience them in all sorts of different places. And I think it's just like what are the steps that we're taking to gradually like whittle away at that. And maybe that's a bit pessimistic or something like that, but I would say that just like for all the queer and trans folks here, I'm sure you can agree that like the bad experiences don't go away. Just the good experiences also increase. Yeah.
I really like that, just the simple fact of inclusion. That's really powerful. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Maybe just a suggestion based on my own work in community engagement for housing and shelter providers. I'm part of a small group that does workshops specifically for external stakeholders, external groups aimed at like homelessness 101, harm reduction, mental health, and de-escalation techniques. With Pacewood, what we did was we expanded it to also do a workshop on intersections of homelessness and 2S LGBTQ identities to raise awareness, and that can be powerful work. It's really important. You can there's endless community groups that you can try to approach and maybe partner with 2S LGBTQ community groups that way, and start to do the long work of really shifting the conversation in the larger city or community about these issues.
Yeah, I have a thought to share as well, especially working in a lot of lived experience spaces where the main thing that brings us together is our lived experience of homelessness and violations of our human right to housing. So there's lots of different intersections that people bring to the table. And I think, we experience a lot of really tense situations, a lot of really great situations, a lot of things where people bring their knowledge and lived experience to the table as whole people who have a range of different identities and experiences and communities that they're a part of that matter to them. And I think we don't always have ways of bringing our lived experiences together in a safe way. I don't think the system really teaches us how to do that work well together. And so it's a matter of building a community. And so one of the things that I've been really thankful to learn from the community that I'm a part of, and also working with Jane does this really well, about building spaces where people can learn from one another, and to bring people together as experts in their own experience, but in a way that allows us all to kind of learn and grow and not necessarily have all the information we need, but we build those pieces together. And I think that it's just really important to be able to know that it's not just about gender diversity, but there's so many ways that we can ground our work in an acknowledgement of our lived expertise. And I think in lived experience spaces, one of the things I like to say is that it's not just about the housing situations that you've experienced, but it's about recognizing that all of the things that you have experienced in your life matter because they've brought you to the space that you're in with others. I think, the work of solidarity and justice is hard. It's really hard. And so it takes a lot of coming back to tables even when harm has been done. And I think, no one in our communities is disposable, and we have to find ways to stand in solidarity even when people have harmed you or harmed others. And I think, we don't necessarily have all the language and all the tools to be able to do that perfectly. But as others have said, even just asking the question, I think shows that you're doing something right, that you're on a good path. But yeah, just lots of solidarity for that.
Sorry, I just wanted to add this to, in working through those questions, like paying attention to the intersections, is that one thing that I've noticed is that I often have like a way easier time getting included than trans people of color. And also I get more opportunities to share my voices. The things that I say that are issues for me are more likely to get responded to. And that ends up being that you end up with this like forms of trans inclusion that are very white. And that are based around like white cultural norms, like white passing expectations. So I think just like making sure that the voices that you're hearing that are advising the ways you might be changing programs or adapting them or like are not just me, Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. We've got time for one or two more questions. We'll go over there. Top recommendations for training in the housing sector.
I'm going to pitch my work. So right now we're only funded for Toronto, but I'm really hoping that as we get through Toronto, that we'll be able to convince sort of other spaces. But currently we're creating this sort of training for shelter workers that first, right now our education and training program does this, where we say, this is what the Ontario Human Rights Code talks about in regards to sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation. This is how to use pronouns. All of that's really important, of course, as a baseline. But it's not enough to just know that people exist, and it's not enough to just not hate people. We have to do more, right? So the further training that we're aiming to do is looking at some of these intersections, like talking about newcomer and refugee experiences, about Indigenous experiences, Two-Spirit experiences, harm reduction, all of these different sort of spaces, and then saying, what are people's biases, what are the policies that are either being applied poorly or that don't exist. And so I would say there's these baseline trainings that I think everybody should be doing because it is important for individuals to understand in their work and frontline staff, but also management of even if you're not talking to residents, if you're talking to queer and trans workers, of course we're in every space that exists. So if we're not visible, there's a reason for it. But I think it's about taking that next step. So it's not just about the training, it's also about the implementation of the training. And I think in every city, there's probably folks who are doing the inclusion work. Here we are, hello, be nice, do better. But also I think it's about taking those pieces into our team meetings and saying, how do we apply this work day to day? Do we know what transphobia sounds like, looks like? To the idea of, residents doing some of this harm, sometimes it's because staff don't actually know what transphobia sounds like, and so they get a complaint and they say, well, okay, of course that person was going to say something, because they don't know that they're like building on transphobia, right? So I think it's about sort of really looking at what the core issues are, what the expectations that we have, the cis-sexism in our spaces, and saying, how can we break that apart? Because doing individual training, 1 3-hour training session is not going to be enough to sort of break the norms that we have. So I don't know what sort of key ones there would be across the country, but I would say it's about looking at what you don't, you can't know what you don't know necessarily, but if you're not talking about this already, maybe go back to your teams and say, maybe next month, let's have a conversation about trans inclusion. I don't know a lot, but I know that we need to talk about it. And that's where you start, and you sort of can grassroots.
Just thought I'd quickly plug my work too, that at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, we run the Homelessness Learning Hub, homelessnesslearninghub.ca, and it has all free self-paced trainings. So we've got one about 2S LGBTQ inclusion and issues in general. And we have another one about specifically housing programs for women and gender diverse people. So the goal is to just create trainings that can be used by students, by researchers, by frontline workers, just integrated into existing training programs. And if you have feedback on them, please let us know too. Or if you have things that you need training on.
And another one's coming on queer and trans youth that I'm working with Karen on right now. So good plug. I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
This one is specifically for those with lived experience. Just as an organization that operates gender-based violence organizations in Nova Scotia, we're wondering what we can do better support those who do not identify as binary or who might be otherwise gender diverse. So just specifically what you would look for going into a shelter.
Right. So how to support those who are outside the gender binary as folks working within gender-based violence. Anyone?
I can offer a couple of thoughts on that from both my own work and experiences and our research. I think that one thing we found, I guess across who we spoke with who were either gender fluid or gender diverse, was that shelter spaces are so binary, like by nature, and have been for so long, that even thinking of accessing services was a barrier for some people, because they couldn't even start to think of a space that was open in terms of what they could access in their gender. And so a couple of things I would say is making it really clear and doing outreach to say, like, we have spaces that are gender neutral, or there's spaces that you can come and talk to someone before that, because even that first step is such a barrier when people are like, well, I guess women's shelters are for women and other folks now. And that's not the creation of a space that is open for people who identify as non-binary. But I think the other piece comes from our broader work, which is lived experience leadership. And so making sure that you have folks with lived experience of homelessness, that you have non-binary people who are in positions of power and are making decisions about what a space could look like in ongoing ways. And so I'd say with a lot of this stuff, we think of like, well, we'll do a training or we'll bring this person in for an advisory session, but what we actually were hearing we need is visibility staff who have those experiences and are shaping the way a space is set up in ongoing ways and are are able to access governance and decision making. And so I'd say that actually was the thing that people said would make the most difference, going into a space and seeing someone else who was non-binary, and knowing they could talk to them and access that space.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And Jane, I loved what you said about centering people with lived experience who are already accessing your spaces and seeing, if people are willing to have a conversation about what have you experienced, what are you seeing in this space, what would make the space better for you, without necessarily requiring the labor of people who are most impacted and most marginalized if they don't want to provide that labor. I wrote a couple notes because I was like, I love this question. First, ask people what they need. I think there's a really important process for feedback, anonymous feedback, to be able to be given so that people have a way of saying, I don't necessarily want to bring this forward directly and have my name attached to it, but I want to have a space where I can say something really fucked up happened to me, and to be able to name that safely without any harm or repercussions. I think that even when a service is set up and people think, it's a good space, sometimes that backlash can be very subtle, can be very covert, and it can lead to further and very deep exclusion. I think one of the things we also found in our work and experiences, and just being part of communities, is this sense of scrutiny and surveillance, especially for gender diverse people with intersecting identities, especially racialized queer and trans people, but also disabled queer and trans people. And so these things are symptoms and signals of deeper systemic harms and types of oppression. And so it's about inclusion, but it's also about, how are we making spaces that actively challenge and subvert these harmful systems that shelters are just kind of existing within. And then one last thought is sometimes shelters don't necessarily have a perfect idea of who they are serving and who they are not serving. One of the things we heard a lot is that a lot of services say, we're open to providing services to Two-Spirit folks. Two-Spirit folks don't access those services. And so a shelter might think, Two-Spirit folks are coming in here, maybe that's not the case. Or a shelter might say, well, we'd like to serve trans folks, but we don't think we're currently serving trans folks. Trans folks probably are in that space. If they're not identifying, it's because there's something that's making that space unsafe to disclose in. And I think the comment about queer and trans people are everywhere. We are. We're everywhere. And so it's really just about, actively centering the experiences of people who are going to be most impacted by the services or the consequences of whatever's being offered in that space. I also think transparency and honesty and openness is really important in creating better spaces, to say, this is an ongoing process, but here are all the things we're trying to do. Here are some of our ideas. Here's our budget. Here's what we can do. It's really important to bring people into that conversation and be really honest about what it is that is possible within your space, or what it is that you're thinking of doing. I think sometimes as people with lived experience, we're excluded from conversations where decisions are actually being made. And I think it's really, really important that we're meaningfully included in these discussions, because it's going to impact our lives and well-being and futures. So just some thoughts.
Those feel like very good thoughts to end on, particularly the we're everywhere kind of spy power vibes. I like that. Okay, we're at time. Thank you so much to all of our presenters for sharing so much knowledge and wisdom and experiences with us. Thank you to everyone for being so attentive and asking great questions. Have a great rest of the conference, and thank you so much.